reported in the closing verses of 2 Samuel 5. The first took place in the valley of Rephaim, just southwest of Jerusalem, where David, having consulted the Lord through the ephod, attacked frontally and broke the Philistine line at a place he renamed Baal-perazim, the master of breakthroughs. The second, weeks later, in the same valley, David won by an oblique flanking maneuver, circling around to the rear of the Philistine line. The text in 2 Samuel 5 verse 24 says, "While he waited to hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees before charging, he pursued the Philistines from Gibeon all the way down the valley to Gezer." The wars summarized in 2 Samuel 8 finished what those battles had started. The text says, David subdued the Philistines and took the city of Metheghamah, almost certainly a reference to Gath itself, which Iron AA archaeology at Tel Es-Safi confirms went into a long demographic decline in the 10th century. The Pentapolis would never threaten Israel as a coordinated military power again. The campaign against Moab was the harshest single act of David's reign. Moab lay across the Jordan, on the high plateau east of the Dead Sea, and David had once trusted Moab enough to leave his parents there for safekeeping during the years he was on the run from Saul. What had broken that relationship by the time of the Empire Wars, the text does not say. Some later Jewish tradition, including the Targum on Ruth, reads a hint into the silence and assumes Moab betrayed his parents. Whatever the cause, in 2 Samuel 8, verse 2, the text describes the punishment. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. 2/3 of the Moabite military population was executed in the field. The 3rd that lived became Davidic vassals and brought him tribute. The Edomites, on the desert plateau south of the Dead Sea, came next. The decisive engagement was in the Valley of Salt, almost certainly the area south of the Dead Sea where the Idib Wadi al-Mil still cuts through deposits of evaporate salt. And the text in 2 Samuel 8 verse 13 attributes the victory to David himself, while the parallel account in 1 Chronicles 18 credits Abishai, Joab's brother. Joab finished the campaign over a 6-month occupation that, the text in 1 Kings 11 will note years later, killed every adult male in Edom, leaving only women, children, and the boy Prince Hadad, who escaped to Egypt to grow up at Pharaoh's court. Edomite copper, mined at sites like Kirbat en-Nahas in the Wadi Feinan, whose carbon dates have been argued by Thomas Levy too, fall squarely within the 10th century before Christ, came into the Israelite tribute system. David garrisoned the country with Israelite troops. The northern campaign was the most ambitious. The Aramean kingdoms of the 10th century before Christ formed a loose patchwork. Aram Damascus to the south, Aram Zobah in the anti-Lebanon range, Bit Rehob beyond it, Hamath further north. The dominant power was Aram Zobah, ruled by Hadadezer son of Rehob. David moved north against him. The text in 2 Samuel 8 says, to restore his control along the Euphrates River. The implied frontier is enormous. The army he met included 1,000 chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers, the kind of force only the larger Aramean confederations could field. David captured the chariot teams and disabled the horses, hamstringing all but 100 of them. Damascus, which sent reinforcements to Hadadezer, fell in turn, and Israelite garrisons were placed inside the city, the bronze taken from the Aramean cities. The text in 1 Chronicles 18 notes, would later supply Solomon's bronze sea and pillars in the Jerusalem temple. The Ammonite war was the longest and the strangest. The trigger, the narrator tells in the 10th chapter of 2 Samuel, was diplomatic. The king of Ammon, Nahash, had been an old ally of David's. When Nahash died, David sent envoys to express sympathy to his son Hanun. Hanun's advisors persuaded him the envoys were spies. He had them seized, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their robes at the buttocks, and sent them back. The insult was unpardonable. David sent the army across the Jordan, and Joab fought a famous two-front battle near the gates of Rabbah, the Ammonite capital, the modern Ammon, against an Ammonite force in front of him and an Aramean mercenary force behind him. He divided his men, gave Abishai the rear, and broke both forces in a single day. The next year, Hadadezer came south himself with the full Aramean coalition. David crossed the Jordan in person and broke them at Helam, killing 700 charioteers and 40,000 foot. Aram surrendered and made peace. The Ammonites, abandoned by their allies, retreated inside the walls of Rabbah and prepared for siege. Joab took Rabbah's water city the following year. The city's main fortress, on the upper Acropolis, held out longer. He sent word to David in 2 Samuel 12, verse 28, a verse the editors of Samuel hold for the chapter that follows, because they were saving the second half of the Rabbah narrative for the Bathsheba story. To come and take the city himself, lest the city be called by Joab's name. David came, broke the upper city, took the Ammonite king's crown. The text says it weighed a talent of gold, set with precious stones, and put it on his own head. The empire that resulted ran, in summary terms the text uses repeatedly, from Lebo-Hamath in the north, on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, to the Brook of Egypt in the south, the Wadi el-Arish on the edge of the Sinai. It was a tributary system, not a fully administered province, but it was the largest political structure ever built in the central Levant by an Israelite king. The text in 2 Samuel 8 verse 15 summarizes the result with a single sentence. The rest of the books of Kings will measure every later king. Against, David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. The empire would not survive intact past Solomon's son, but the dynasty would. And in the year Joab took Rabbah, the king who had reigned doing what was just and right was about to do the thing for which the rest of the biblical tradition would never quite forgive him. The chronology of the Bathsheba episode is precise. The 11th chapter of 2 Samuel opens with the line that gives the whole story its political frame. In 2 Samuel 11 verse 1, the text says, "In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem." The detail mattered to the editors of Samuel. Spring was campaigning season. The Ammonite war Joab had begun the previous year was in its final phase. The siege of Rabbah was the climax of the entire imperial decade narrated in chapter 8. And the king, for the first time in his life, was not on the line. The man who had run from Saul through 10 years of caves, who had led 600 from Ziklag, who had broken the Aramean coalition at Helam, was 40-some years old and at home. He walked on the roof of the palace one evening. The text says, "And from that height, the upper terrace of the large stone structure on the eastern slope of the city of David, with its commanding view down into the densely built lower terraces of the city, he could see into the courtyards of the houses below. A woman was bathing. The narrator gives no internal monologue and no dialogue. He gives only a sequence of verbs. David saw, David sent, David asked, The reports come back. Her name is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam. She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The mention of Uriah is itself a comment. Uriah is one of the 30, the elite warriors whose names the editors of Samuel preserve in the catalogue of David's mighty men ensue. Samuel 23, a list so old, so historically anchored, that scholars from the early 20th century onward have treated it as one of the most reliable archival sources in the entire books of Samuel. Uriah was, at this exact moment, on the line at Rabbah. His name is also a comment. Uriah, Yahweh is my light, is a Yahwistic name, but his ethnic designation is Hittite, pointing to the population of Anatolian and northern Syrian descent that had spread south through the Levant after the collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1180 before Christ, and that by David's century had assimilated into Israelite religion while retaining the ethnic label. The man whose wife David was about to take was a foreigner who served Israel's God more faithfully than the king he served. Bathsheba conceived. The narrator's report in 2 Samuel 11 verse 5 is 2 words long in the Hebrew, I am pregnant. The political problem was instant. Uriah had been on campaign for months. There was no innocent explanation. David sent for Uriah from the front under cover of an inquiry into the progress of the war, hoping the soldier, given a night at home, would sleep with his wife and so cover the timing of the pregnancy. Uriah refused. He slept at the door of the palace with the king's servants. When David asked him why, Uriah's answer in 2 Samuel 11 verse 11 is the moral center of the chapter. The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. The sentence kills him. David tried again the next night, this time getting Uriah drunk. Uriah still slept at the palace door. The king, who could not break the soldier, turned to the only solution left. He wrote a letter to Joab. He sent it back to the front by Uriah's own hand. The letter, in 2 Samuel 11 verse 15, contained 3 sentences. Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die. Joab carried out the order with the trained pragmatism of a general who had done worse for less reason. He sent Uriah to a place near the wall of Rabbah, where Ammonite archers were known to engage from above, withdrew the supporting force at the right moment, and lost a number of other Israelite soldiers in the engagement to disguise the operation. He sent a runner back to Jerusalem with the casualty list. He told the runner, the text says, that if the king grew angry over the unnecessary deaths, the runner was to add at the end, moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. The phrase did its work. The text in 2 Samuel 11 verse 25 records David's reply, word for word. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Bathsheba mourned for her husband for the customary days. After the mourning was over, David sent for her, brought her into his house, and she became his wife. She bore him a son. The chapter ends with a single editorial sentence in 2 Samuel 11 verse 27. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. The next chapter opens with a knock on the palace door. Nathan, the same prophet who had brought the dynastic covenant a few years earlier, came to David and told him a story. The story is one of the cleanest pieces of prophetic confrontation literature in the entire Hebrew Bible, and its closest formal parallels lie in the 18th century before Christ Mari, Letters from the Middle, Euphrates, where ecstatic prophets routinely confronted kings on the moral failures of court. Nathan's parable in 2 Samuel 12 verses 1 to 4 describes a rich man who owned many sheep and a poor man who owned only one little ewe lamb, raised in his lap, drinking from his cup, sleeping in his arms like a daughter. A traveler came to the rich man, and rather than slaughter one of his own flock, the rich man took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the meal. David, hearing the story, became furious. In 2 Samuel 12 verses 5 and 6, he swore by the Lord that the rich man deserved to die, and ordered him to pay back the lamb 4 times over. Nathan answered him with the most concentrated single sentence the prophets ever spoke to a king. In 2 Samuel 12 verse 7 he said, "You are the man." The Hebrew is 2 words, ata ha'ish. The whole moral architecture of the rest of the chapter rises and falls on those 2 words. The rest of the oracle, in verses 9 to 12, is the judgment. The sword would never depart from David's house. Calamity would rise against him from within his own family. What he had done in secret would be done to his own wives in broad daylight, in front of all Israel. David's response in 2 Samuel 12 verse 13 is also 2 words in the Hebrew, katati layu, I have sinned against the Lord. The 51st Psalm, in its superscription, attributes itself to this exact moment. Nathan accepted the confession. The Lord, he said, had taken away the sin, but the child Bathsheba had borne would die. The child fell ill. David fasted, lay on the ground, refused to eat or rise. For the 7 days the boy lingered. The servants were afraid to tell him when the child died. David read it in their faces, washed, ate, and worshipped, and gave them the explanation that has become one of the lines most often quoted from his life in 2 Samuel 12, verse 23. While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. The grief was real. The political damage was permanent. David comforted Bathsheba, the text adds, and went to her again, and she bore another son. They named him Solomon, Shlomo, the peaceful one. The Lord loved him. The prophet Nathan, in 2 Samuel 12 verse 25, came back to the palace and gave the boy a second name from the Lord, Jedidiah, loved by Yahweh. It is the only place in the Hebrew Bible the name appears, and it remains 3,000 years later, the only divinely given throne name attached to any king of Israel. The man who would build the temple was the second child of the marriage that should not have happened. Nathan's prophecy began to unfold inside the palace within a few years. The judgment that the sword would never depart from David's house took the shape of David's own children. The crown prince by birth order was Amnon, son of David's wife Ahinoam. The most beautiful of the daughters was Tamar, full sister of Absalom, son of Maacah, daughter of the king of Geshur in southern Syria. The 13th chapter of 2 Samuel opens with a single sentence the editors of the succession narrative. The long court history Leonhard Rost identified in 1926 as a unified literary source, running from 2 Samuel 9 through the 2nd chapter of 1 Kings, placed at the head of everything that follows. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. What happened next? The text reports in language as restrained, as it is unsparing. Amnon, with the counsel of his cousin Jonadab, feigned illness, asked David to send Tamar to prepare food at his bedside, and assaulted her in his bedchamber. Tamar pleaded with him in 2 Samuel 13 verse 12, "No, my brother, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing." He overpowered her, and afterward, the text says, he hated her with a hatred greater than the love he had felt before. He sent her away. She tore the ornamented robe she was wearing. The long-sleeved garment the text in verse 18 identifies as the customary dress of unmarried daughters of the king, put ashes on her head, and walked weeping back to her brother Absalom's house. She lived there the rest of her life as a desolate woman. David, when he heard, was furious, but the text in 2 Samuel 13 verse 21 records that he did nothing. Absalom said nothing for 2 years. Then he invited all the king's sons to a sheep-shearing feast at his estate at Baal-Hazor, north of Jerusalem, and ordered his servants when Amnon was drunk to kill him. They did. Absalom fled across the Jordan to Geshur to his maternal grandfather Talmai, and stayed there 3 years. The text in 2 Samuel 13 verse 39 records David's heart in 3 words. He longed to go to Absalom. Joab, reading the king's silence and arranging the politics David was unwilling to handle, sent a wise woman from Tekoa to Jerusalem with a parable that engineered Absalom's recall. Absalom returned. He was forbidden the king's presence for 2 more years before David finally kissed him. Absalom used the next 4 years to build a base. He rose early, the text in 2 Samuel 15 says, and stood at the city gate where every Israelite coming to the king for justice passed him first. He would tell each one his case was good and right, then add that there was no one appointed by the king to hear it. He kissed the men who tried to bow to him. He lived ostentatiously with a chariot, 50 runners, and the most beautiful hair in Israel. Slowly, the narrator says, he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. When the moment came, he asked David's permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a vow. The choice of Hebron was deliberate. It was the city where David had first been anointed, the original capital, the seat of southern legitimacy. From Hebron, Absalom proclaimed himself king. The conspiracy was wider than David had realized. Ahithophel the Gilonite, his most trusted counselor, and Bathsheba, and the genealogies suggest Bathsheba's grandfather joined Absalom. So did much of the militia of Judah. David, hearing in Jerusalem that the hearts of the men of Israel had turned, did the thing no one expected. He abandoned the city. In 2 Samuel 15 verse 14, he told his officials, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." He left 10 concubines to look after the palace, walked barefoot up the Mount of Olives weeping, and crossed the Kidron with his household, his bodyguard of Cherethites and Pelethites, and 600 men from Gath under Ittai the Gittite. The Levites brought the ark out of the city to follow him. David sent it back. In 2 Samuel 15 verse 25, he told Zadok the priest, "If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, 'I am not pleased with you,' then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." 2 strategic moves saved him. The first was Hushai the Archite, an old friend whom David sent back into Jerusalem to feign loyalty to Absalom and undermine Ahithophel's counsel from the inside. The second was the network of priests and servants who would carry intelligence out of the city to David across the Jordan. By the time Absalom entered Jerusalem, Hushai was already in place at his court. Absalom, in a public act calculated to consummate his usurpation, took the 10 concubines David had left and slept with them in a tent pitched on the roof of the palace, exactly fulfilling the prophecy Nathan had given a decade earlier. Ahithophel counseled an immediate strike with 12,000 chosen men before David could organize across the Jordan. The counsel was sound. It would have ended the rebellion that night. Hushai countered it in 2 Samuel 17 with a longer plan that flattered Absalom's ego and bought David the most valuable thing on earth in that moment, which was time. Absalom accepted Hushai's plan. Ahithophel saw that the rebellion was lost, rode home to Gilo, set his house in order, and hanged himself. One of the very few suicides the Hebrew Bible records. David crossed the Jordan to Mahanaim, the eastern tribes, the very Gileadites Saul had once saved at Jabesh Gilead, fed him, equipped him, and gave him the ground to assemble a counterforce. Joab took command of the army. The decisive battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim, a wooded ridge on the eastern side of the Jordan, whose oaks and broken terrain swallowed the larger Israelite force Absalom had assembled in the open plain. The text in 2 Samuel 18 verse 8 says that on that day the forest claimed more lives than the sword did. Absalom himself, riding under the low branches of a great oak, caught his head in the boughs and was left hanging from the tree as his mule walked out from under him. A soldier found him and reported it to Joab. David's command to all 3 of his generals before the battle had been explicit: "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." Joab took 3 javelins and drove them through Absalom's heart, while the boy was still alive in the tree. 10 of his armor-bearers finished him. The runner who brought the news to David at the gate of Mahanaim was the priest's son Ahimaaz, who arrived first but could not bring himself to tell the king his son was dead. A Cushite messenger arriving moments later did. David's reaction, recorded in 2 Samuel 18 verse 33, is one of the most quoted laments in the Hebrew Bible. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, my son." Joab came into the king's chamber and rebuked him, told him that if he did not stop weeping for the son who had hunted him, and start thanking the soldiers who had saved his life, he would lose every man in his army by morning. David rose. He went to the gate. He received the troops as they returned. The kingdom did not snap back into place at once. As David crossed the Jordan to return to Jerusalem, a Benjaminite named Sheba, son of Bichri, sounded a horn and called the northern tribes away. In 2 Samuel 20, verse 1, he said, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son. Every man to his tent. Israel!" David sent Joab north after Sheba. Joab pursued him to the walled city of Abel-Beth-Maachah in the upper Jordan Valley and besieged it. A wise woman of the city negotiated with Joab from the wall. The men of the city threw Sheba's head down to him over the parapet, and the rebellion ended. The king came home. The throne was, for the moment, his again, but the cost had been counted. The sword had not departed from his house, and would not depart from it again. The census came late in his reign. The text in 2 Samuel 24 says, David ordered Joab to count the fighting men of Israel and Judah. And Joab, normally the most willing instrument of the king's worst impulses, this time refused. He warned David in 2 Samuel 24 verse 3, "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" David overruled him. Joab and the army commanders covered the country in 9 months and 20 days, working the tribes from the southern desert to Dan and back through Tyre and Sidon, and reported the count: 800,000 sword-bearing men in Israel, 500,000 in Judah. The narrator does not say directly why the census was a sin. Most commentators, from the rabbinic tradition through John Calvin to P. Kyle MacArthur, read the offence as an act of royal pride that imagined the king's strength to lie in his soldiery rather than in the Lord. David's heart struck him. The prophet Gad came to him with 3 options: 3 years of famine, 3 months of military defeat, or 3 days of plague. David chose the plague. 70,000 died across the country. The angel of the Lord, the text says, was about to extend his hand against Jerusalem itself when the Lord called him back at the threshing floor of a Jebusite landowner named Araunah on the upper hill north of the city of David. David bought the threshing floor. He insisted in 2 Samuel 24 verse 24 on paying full price even when Araunah offered to give it freely. "I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." He paid 50 shekels of silver for the floor and the oxen, raised an altar, and the plague stopped. The location of that altar would become the most contested square of land in human history. The chronicler, in 1 Chronicles 22, identifies it explicitly as the site of the future temple Solomon would build. The rocky outcrop now under the dome of the rock at the center of the Temple Mount, an ancient threshing floor on a ridge of bedrock that from the Bronze Age onward had likely served as a Jebusite cult site. David's purchase of it, in the editorial logic of the chronicler, is the bridge between Jerusalem, the political capital, and Jerusalem, the cultic center. David grew old and could not keep warm. The first chapter of 1 Kings opens with his servants searching the country for a young woman to lie beside him at night for warmth. They found Abishag the Shunammite, who served him as nurse though. The text in 1 Kings 1 verse 4 is careful to note the king had no relations with her. The detail tells the reader the king's strength was visibly gone. His 4th son, Adonijah, Absalom's full brother by Haggith, the eldest surviving prince after the deaths of Amnon and Absalom, read the political weather and moved. He gathered chariots and runners just as Absalom once had, secured the support of Joab and Abiathar the priest, and held a coronation feast at the spring of Enrogel south of the city, where he had himself acclaimed king while David still lived in his palace half a kilometer to the north. Bathsheba and Nathan moved to counter him. Nathan came to Bathsheba and reminded her of David's old promise that Solomon would succeed him. She went into the king's bedchamber, bowed and reported what was happening at Enrogel. Nathan came in moments later with the choreography of a man who knew his timing and confirmed the report. David, the text says, rallied the way he had rallied at every earlier crisis of his career. He swore by the Lord in 1 Kings 23, 1 verse 30, "As I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place." He summoned Zadok the priest, the prophet Nathan, and Benaiah, commander of the bodyguard, and ordered Solomon set on the king's own mule, taken down to the spring of Gihon, the natural spring at the foot of the eastern slope of the city of David, where Hezekiah's later tunnel still channels water into the pool of Siloam, and anointed there before all the people. The shofar was blown. The crowd shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" The noise reached Adonijah's banquet at Enrogel, and the guests scattered. Adonijah ran for sanctuary at the horns of the altar. Solomon let him live, on the condition that he show himself a worthy man. The last formal scene of David's life is the charge to Solomon. The aged king summoned his son and gave him the political testament that Christian and Jewish readers have long understood as the bookend to the Davidic covenant. In 1 Kings 2 verses 2 and 3, David said, "I am about to go the way of all the earth. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses." He told him to remember the loyalty of Bathsheba, the Gileadite who had fed the army at Mahanaim. He told him to deal carefully with Joab and with Shimei the Benjaminite, who had cursed him during the flight from Absalom. The political house was being put in order with the same precision that had characterized the king's better years. The chronicler's parallel adds a second farewell, addressed not to Solomon alone, but to the whole assembly of the leaders of Israel. David showed them the plans he had drawn for the temple Solomon would build, the materials he had stockpiled, the courses of priests and Levites he had organized. He led the assembly in a final prayer. In 1 Chronicles 29 verse 11 he said, "Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor, for everything in heaven and earth is yours." It is the prayer the King James translators, 2.5 millennia later, would render in the cadences that eventually entered Christian liturgy as the doxology of the Lord's Prayer. David died after reigning 40 years, 7.5 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. The text in 1 Kings 2 verse 10 gives the burial in a single sentence. Then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. The tomb itself was somewhere on Chew and Vieuf, the southeastern slope of the spur, the upper end of the early Iron Age city. 500 years later, the prophet Nehemiah would mention the tombs of the kings of David's house as still visible on that slope. The dynasty he founded ran longer than any other monarchy in the ancient Near East. 21 kings of his line sat on the throne in Jerusalem after him, in unbroken succession from Solomon to Zedekiah, until the Babylonian armies of Nebuchadnezzar broke the city in 586 before Christ. 424 years. The Teldan Stele, written in Aramaic about 150 years after his death, calls the line by his name, the Baiti Dabrigud, the House of David. The Mesha Stele in Moab, in roughly the same period, almost certainly does the same. By the prophets of the exile and the return, his name had become shorthand for the future hope of Israel. By the Gospels, 1,000 years after his death, the genealogies of Matthew and Luke would still trace the line of a carpenter in Galilee back to a shepherd boy in Bethlehem. The horn of oil that Samuel had emptied on a teenager in his father's pasture was, by any reasonable measure of historical influence, the most consequential anointing ever performed by any prophet of any religion in the world. He died around the year 970 before Christ. He has not stopped mattering since.